Craig. Thanks for joining us for this interview. I just want to take a second to introduce the beginnings. Craig Kelley was a Cambridge councillor for 14 years. He chaired traffic, parking, and transportation, as well as the public safety committees. Craig is an expert on micromobility devices like shared bikes and electric scooters, as well as an avid biker. Now he works on overcoming the challenges those technologies pose and specific steps municipal and federal governments will have to make maximum positive impact of the technologies. Craig served as a platoon leader in the Marine Corps before earning a law degree from Boston College and a master's in public administration from Harvard, where he served as research fellow in municipal resiliency. Last year, he founded Urban Core Strategies, a consulting firm focused on bridging the gap between government and the governed, and specializing in city-level solutions for emerging urban challenges. Hey, Craig.
Hello, Sebastian.
So, one of the things I mentioned in your intro is that you served some time as a Marine, and I was wondering how you felt that had influenced your experience working with urban systems and urban logistics as a city councilor.
Well, it's true. I think that being a Marine has influenced pretty much everything I have done. I signed up for the Marine Corps when I was 17, and I got my discharge when I was, I don't know, probably like 30, although a bunch of that was ROTC and a bunch of that was reserves. But nonetheless, it's a core way of how I look at things. But before I get into that, let me just explain a little bit more to people about who I am.
Oh, sure.
And this is me and my wife from probably 20 years ago. You can see Robbie now, he's 23, so maybe it's 18 years ago. It's probably 5 in that picture, and Goops is maybe 2 or 3, and he's 20 now. And sure. I won't tell you how old Hope is now, but she was younger then, as was I. But you can see that we've got the bikes and the bike trailer, and Robbie's on, I think, a little tow-along bike. Mm-hmm. I have no idea where this is, but this was simply how we used to get around when the kids were younger. And then we got rid of our car. We had 2 cars at one point, one that we had bought and one that we had inherited, and they both died. And then we just got along without cars. And I was consulting at that point for the Army Reserves about 35 miles away. So I'd take the train, I'd rent cars, I'd borrow cars. There's really this hodgepodge of ways to get around, but it certainly shows that you can do it. And if you do that sort of car, I like to call it car-like because it's certainly not car-free. But if you do that car-like transportation, whether you're biking or walking or taking the T or whatever, you realize just how complex getting to places can be and how much goes into getting you from point A to point B. And that brings up my second point, which you asked me, how did the Marine Corps influence my view in cities? Right. And I think what happens, anyone that is a military professional really thinks a lot about logistics.
Of course.
And the saying is, amateurs think about tactics, how you win battles. Professionals think about logistics, which is how you win war or war effort. And I want to throw up a piece of data here that's probably, well, you've seen this before, I believe.
Yes.
So this is arguably the most famous data visualization in history. And you can see it's Napoleon's advance to Moscow and his retreat. And here we've got 420,000 soldiers. It gets slower and slower, and the smaller and smaller as you get to Moscow. And by the time you get back from Moscow, and there's next to nothing. And we've all seen the pictures, the paintings of those horrible winters and so forth. So amongst other things, Napoleon did not manage his supply chain well. As good a soldier as he was, and as professional as he was in so many other ways, he overstretched his supply chain, and his invasion fell apart. Now, I'm not going to say that running a city is a war, but it does require a real focus on logistics. And say you run a coffee shop or something like that, a bike shop. You've got to think about the logistics of how you get your inventory in. It's a coffee shop. Your coffee cups got to come in. Your cleaning supplies, your coffee, then your workers have to come in, and your customers have to come in. All that stuff has to come in from around the world and wind up at your doorstep in your store when you want it to be there. The customers, the workers, the suppliers, all this stuff has to be there at the same time. And also at the same time, you have to have the electricity and the water and all these other infrastructure things.
Right. Yeah.
So complexity and logistics, I think, is at the heart of a military experience, and it's at the heart of making a city run. So when I look back to my Marine Corps experience, what I really take away is things might look simple on the outside. You go in, you get your coffee, you go buy your bike or whatever,
Sure.
but there's an immense amount of logistical support that makes that simple stuff happen.
Right. Right. Yeah. Every road from here to Seattle to get your Starbucks, right?
Exactly. Or the tea I'm drinking now, I don't know where the honey came from, but the lemon probably from Florida
Sure.
or Chile, for all I know.
Interesting. Okay, so you mentioned you kind of transitioned to biking when your kids were quite young, which is sort of a brave time to do it, I guess, right? It's all the more challenging at that point. And what kind of encouraged you to do that, sparked the desire to make that transition?
Well, Hope and I met while we were biking. She was
Okay.
pushing her bicycle along with a broken leg, a cast on a leg. That's what caught my attention because that's what I did when I broke my ankle at airborne school. So we met biking, and biking was a big part of our relationship. And as soon as
Sure.
Robbie was born, we put him in a car seat and then strapped the car seat in the
Sure.
burley.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
our kids had been on bikes for forever. And one of the things about living in a city is you've got the density, you've got challenges with traffic, both pedestrian and other
Yeah.
bikes as well as cars. But you've got the density where you can do something usefully on a bicycle. I've done a lot of long distance biking.
Right.
And when you're going 10, 15 miles between services, it's difficult to conceive of how that could usefully be done by bicycle.
Right.
But
Of course.
where we live, you can hardly even think of a thing that you might want to purchase that is not within a mile of us or a mile and a half.
Yeah.
I challenge you, from marijuana to liquor. The only thing that we don't have anymore is we don't have a gun store. We used to have a gun store in Porter Square, but
Okay.
anything else is a real honest to God gun. There's a sporting goods, but I called it.
Yeah, I think that you could probably find a sporting goods store within a mile still somewhere.
But I don't think they were sell guns. But regardless, that sort of distance makes being able to do stuff by bikes not just possible, but often easier than by car, because in a place like Cambridge, you don't have to worry about parking and
The
someone like
infamous
me.
Cambridge problem.
What's that?
The infamous Cambridge problem.
It's not just the Cambridge problem, and you also you have to worry about traffic in the sense of getting hit by cars or other bicyclists, which is an increasing hazard. And you need to worry about traffic lights because you should stop for those, although that poses its own dangers because other cyclists don't, and it can become very chaotic. But it's much more dependable to navigate through the city on a bicycle than on a car. You know how long it's going to take you to get someplace, and you don't have to worry really about getting caught in traffic or getting stuck without a parking spot on the other end. So it makes a lot of sense to do things by bicycle. And one of the challenges you run into now, okay, what kind of thing can you do? Well, if you got a bike trail and you're carrying your kid around, at some point your kid's on their own, but you realize that you can carry 60 pounds of kid in your bike trailer, or you can carry 60 pounds of groceries or 60 pounds of office supplies. And then, of course, if you're like me, you just get a bigger bike and a bigger trailer so you can carry the canoe and the kayaks and the furniture and all this other stuff. But there's really very small limit to what you can haul by bicycle on a regular basis. You're not going to easily move a house, and certainly not going to easily go more than a few miles. But in a place like Cambridge, where pretty much everything you need on a regular basis is within a few miles, it becomes really utilitarian to use something that's not a car.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, in Nashville, one of the interesting things about the infrastructure there is that the kind of local roads in some of the neighborhoods are pretty challenging to navigate by car. There are like just stop signs onto main roads and stuff. So there are many places where actually navigating by bicycle turns out to be much, much easier than navigating by car.
It happens that way in a lot of cases. One of the challenges you do run into, though, is on some of these streets that the car traffic can be so fast and the cross traffic conflicts of turning movements so frequent and cyclists not so visible that you can have some serious safety problems.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you did some work with that as a councilman, correct? Some thoughts about like new ways to approach roads and things.
Yeah, so Cambridge just got this Vision Zero bike plan, and my philosophy, and I think arguably it's one of the things that got me unelected last time, is that our bike-centric transportation discussion is increasingly obsolete. And what we think of as a bike is increasingly obsolete. And I've got some pictures here I want to run through. So obviously that's not a bike, that's a train. But that's how people get into Cambridge. That's how you can move people in large numbers, long distances, as long as they all want to get in at the same point or group of points and get off at the same point or group of points. So in this case, that's the inbound lounge. It's bringing people from from say Fort Devens out in Ayr or Leominster. It's bringing them into Porter Square and to Alewife and to downtown Boston. So big groups of people. And then you've got, biking as just this fun thing. This was taken the other day off the Malden River bike path, which is a new part of the East Coast Greenway. Yeah, and that's a fun thing. That bike path is a fun bike path. Arguably, a lot of these places are called multi-use paths, or they function as linear parks or so forth.
Right. Even places to walk a dog or take a walk, but also to bike.
Also to bike, but the biking, one of my good friends, her dad ran into her. The three of us were biking. I slowed, she slowed, her dad didn't slow, ran into her, crushed her pelvis, knocked her unconscious, gave her concussion, and she had bleeding on the brain. And that was on a bike path. So it's a bad idea to think that bike paths are safe simply because we call them bike paths. They're just differently dangerous. They're not necessarily deadly, but they're very dangerous because there's a lot of different types of speeds and chaotic movements and so forth. Nonetheless, that's one type of biking. And then, this isn't really even a bike. This is an elliptical bike, but it's a non-car way of moving around. And that looks like it's more for exercise because it's very difficult to imagine, other than maybe having a trailer, what it is that you would use to carry stuff. Maybe put a backpack on. But and I've seen a bunch of those on the bike path and so forth. I've never ridden one. Those tend, in my mind, to be more, I'm out for the exercise, a different kind of way to get outside. This is down at Atlantic Beach, Florida, which has...
we actually looked into those machines for Bicycling Legends of the West End because they use a treadle mechanism like original bikes did, and so they're kind of one of the small ways that sort of old school bicycling still exists in the modern biking world.
Interesting. Well, this definitely is not an old school vehicle. But this down here is in Atlantic Beach, Florida. And Atlantic Beach, Florida is near Jacksonville. It's on the coast, though. And it's got this just massive, the whole sort of barrier island has a massive bike, pedestrian, something else trail. And this is kind of the something else part. But they also have off-road golf carts that are very popular down there. All the more so because A, you can't go fast, stop sign to stop sign. And B, you don't have a wintertime. The worst maybe it gets in terms of cold temperatures is around freezing every once in a while.
Right.
So having something fully enclosed and heated doesn't become as desirable. But what we're really talking about, I think, is you start thinking, well, I just need something to move things around. Remember, I talked small distances, a few miles, and we're not moving houses. We're moving, in this case, a couple of kids or maybe 6 or 7 bags of groceries. Right. So people get these things that are cargo bikes. And I think I was probably the first person in Boston with a cargo bike. Oh God, 15 years or so ago,
Sure.
with an extra cycle, way back before extra cycles became big.
Okay.
And the first thing I said when I brought it home, and I was showing my wife, I was like, someone is gonna figure out how to put an electric motor on this, and that's going to be the future of urban transportation.
Yep.
And it's true. People have figured out how to put electric motors on it.
Mm-hmm.
I would guess this one is electric. I don't see one, but it could be right in here on the front. Most of them are
Sure.
when they're this big. But when you start having something like this, you got to think, well, where does that fit in our biking infrastructure? The thing's much
Mm-hmm.
wider than a normal bicycle,
Yeah.
handles differently. And as you can see, it's got 3 wheels, which gives it 3 planes. You know, most bicycles with 2 wheels, one right behind the other, they only have
So a
1 plane.
single plane. Yeah.
This is a 3-plane vehicle, which means it's impacting the road, the surface, in 3 places, which makes potholes and that sort of road hazard a bigger issue, not in
I
terms of
see.
costing someone, because that's probably unlikely, but in terms of bumps and flats and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's easier to avoid those kinds of hazards on a bike.
On a traditional 2-wheel bike,
Yes, on a traditional bike.
easier to avoid. Of course, you have to be paying attention, and it's easier to hit those hazards on this sort of thing and not fall, because
Sure.
it's difficult to fall off of a 3-wheeled vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, it can make for a very bumpy ride.
Yeah.
And this isn't even a bicycle, right? This is a scooter.
Mm-hmm.
But our laws are very weird in terms of how we regulate
Yeah.
bicycles, electric bicycles, scooters, stand-up scooters. This is a sit-down scooter. What we
So
really
how much faster can one of these scooters go than, say, a bike with an electric wheel?
So this one's probably capped out at 40. They're
Okay.
40 miles an hour. These are limited by the engine side. It's a 50 cc or more.
Okay.
Is a registerable. It'd have a license plate back here, and it's I believe less than 50, or it might be 50 or less. Gets a little registration sticker, and that little registration sticker, most of them don't have it up to date, but
Okay.
that's a completely different vehicle than something that's just a little bit bigger. But
Right.
they still go quite fast, and their ability to use things like bike lanes and so forth
Mm-hmm.
is also different. The motorcycle style licensed ones with a license plate
Right.
cannot. These guys can. They're not allowed on bike paths, but they're
Okay.
allowed other places where bikes are. So it gets super confusing too, because this is called a scooter, but we'll see. I think maybe later on I have pictures of the stand-up things that are
Yeah.
also called scooters.
Right.
And this is gas powered, and they're electric, and
Or
e-bikes,
just not even powered.
or not even powered at all, right? Just a regular bike could, or sorry, regular scooter you can stand on and kick.
Right.
We don't have a regulation for tricycles, for example. So if I go back to this guy, and it's not clear that this is covered in any sort of regulation that we have. So
Oh,
bicycles aren't allowed on the sidewalk, skateboards aren't allowed on the sidewalk, tricycles, well, they're not allowed on the sidewalk. And in our legal system, we tend to permit that which is not prohibited.
right.
So
So the assumption effectively being that scooter or tricycles are something that children are using their toys.
exactly. And so we haven't caught up from a regulatory or an infrastructure standard with what is actually on the street now. Because this
Hmm.
here, we'll get to some other stuff that's sort of like this in a moment.
Sure.
And this is just an internal combustion engine. They had these things in World War One,
Right.
and just slightly different, right? A little bit
Hmm.
different size, maybe a different layout, but the technology is almost identical. Same thing with the bicycles, traditional bicycles. The safety bike, which is the one with a coaster brake and the two wheels are the same size.
Hmm.
I think those came out in the 1890s ish. So
Okay.
this technology has been around for centuries. Um, and by the way, you should feel to. I got a whole bunch of slides, but feel to interject if you've got
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah.
Um, and so these are just a bike share program. And you can see
Sure.
that they're traditional bikes. Some places will have them be electric bikes. And in the background, you can see the WB Mason delivery truck. And I captured these two things because they illustrate some of the logistical things of a modern city. So this is
Right.
a delivery. Now, these days, with stores all being shut, someone like this could be a truck this big,
Hmm.
could be making deliveries door to door. I see that with
Right.
UPS, not so much with WB Mason, but
Amazon.
the whole delivery economy has changed the logistical challenge of moving stuff in and out of the
Right.
city, because you're not necessarily going straight to stores as a center, but you're actually taking the material from the warehouse or the distributor or the producer in a truck this size and delivering it to Craig Kelley's apartment.
Right.
Um,
And that obviously puts a lot more strain on roads than we're used to with, say, a mail truck.
Absolutely, because you've got all of these vehicles, big vehicles, blocking traffic. Sometimes they just block the bike area, whether it's a lane or not. Sometimes they block cars. And of course, now with COVID-19, it's happening a lot more. But the trend was there earlier, anyways, in terms of home delivery. And City of Cambridge is definitely not leading the way in how to manage that challenge.
Hmm.
It's just sort of, okay, they're here. What do we do? As opposed to trying to figure out licensing techniques, or finding people who are parking illegally. Excuse me.
Right.
And then here you see we've got the blue bikes.
Yep. We have
They're on
some right
there. I
outside
think
of the museum.
third. We have them all over the place. And this is a heavily, heavily subsidized. Now, some people call it a bike share program, but
Hmm.
the difference between share and access is huge. So if I have a
Right.
milkshake and we're not worried about COVID-19, and I hand you my milkshake and you drink some of it,
Hmm.
I'm sharing my milkshake with you because you're my friend. If
Right.
I have a milkshake and you want some and I pour some into a glass and I charge you $1.50, even though you're my friend, uh, you are now accessing my milkshake. You're paying for it. So the access
Right.
economy is really what all this traditionally called shared stuff is. And
Hmm.
these bikes here are heavily, heavily, heavily subsidized. These were probably paid for by Harvard in some sort of mitigation. I don't know that for a fact, but generally someone has an idea to put up a big building or something like that.
Uh,
And one of the mitigation things they say is, well, we'll buy a 10 or a 20 rack of bike share and we'll put it in there. And these
okay.
costs over the course of maybe 3 years, something like $10,000. They're hugely, hugely, hugely expensive,
Hmm.
and they're poorly balanced. So this one's full. There are a few
Yes. Sure.
others that you can't see, but roughly 30% of the time, these dock bikes will either be full, in which case, if you have a bike, you can't drop it off, or they'll be
Hmm.
empty, in which case, if you need a bike, you can't pick one up.
Yeah,
And it's
it's that's actually if you go into this, the seaport, I think is the best example of that I've seen. That around rush hour, they have staff members who collect all the bikes off of the one rack so that people can continue uh,
right.
using them, and
They're,
and there'll be 100 or more bikes at a single station.
and they're trying to balance them logistically, which goes back to my
Right.
point that all this stuff works around logistics. And this was these shared bikes were an idea to get people biking, because biking was supposed to be a great alternative to cars.
It's gonna
And they've
last.
got pluses, but managing them is very, very difficult. And you would never buy into a transportation system that had a 30% failure rate, because I'm not getting on the bike for fun. I'm getting on the bike because I have a meeting, a class, a job, or whatever. When I take
Right.
classes at the Kennedy School, you see these people, 8:40 class, they get to school at 8:25 and the
Hmm.
bike rack's full, and they're literally running, racing each other to the next one, which is by Aubin-Père, and then the next one after that.
Right.
That's not a sustainable system. It's
No.
it's not logistically sound. So, but it's was an interim step to where we'll eventually get in terms of micromobility.
Hmm.
Uh, this is obviously a tour bus,
Yeah.
and you can see it sort of parked in the no parking area. Harvard Square is full of tour buses, as are other places in America. People come, or at least they came from far away,
Hmm.
and they take these nationwide tours. And
Yeah.
and honestly, I've done it too. I can't get angry because I took a week tour of Israel when I was at the Kennedy School,
Hmm.
and you're on a tour bus they're going to drop you off someplace. And if there's 15,000 other tour buses there, the drivers, not going to say, oh, by the way, we're going to skip, the Wailing Wall or
Right.
whatever because we can't park. And I don't expect that of these people either, but managing them becomes a real challenge, and the safety issue is real. We
Right.
just haven't had someone killed yet, but it'll happen, and we'll throw up our hands, and then we'll probably just glide on. And you can see here, this is probably an Uber because that's what I usually take pictures of.
Okay.
But it's someone who's blocking the bike lane, and there's
Right.
an ongoing discussion. And I'm not a separated bike lane fan generally because I think we designed them horribly. But
Okay.
I'm definitely not a painted bike lane fan because this here is a door. You open that door, it's going to come to about here, which means that a little
Sure.
over half of this bike lane is actually the door zone, and this is right up here is really the only safe place to ride.
Right.
But we're
So could
encouraging.
you clarify? So you're saying you don't like the painted bike lanes and you don't like separated bike lanes, but is there a third alternative or?
Well-designed separated bike lanes work. I
Okay.
think where we really need to worry about bike safety is at the intersections. And
Right.
unfortunately, separated bike lanes generally don't do that very well. For example, if you are on the inside of a bunch of parked cars, as some of these separated lanes are,
Hmm.
traffic that's going in your direction is very likely to overlook you. And if you hit
Right.
the intersection at the same time as a right-hand turning car, you can be in very much danger. There's an opinion piece in the New York Times about that, I think yesterday or the day before.
Oh,
And that's been my experience. And for example, on the Beacon Hill one or the Beacon Street one, I take the street because
uh-huh.
I feel it's too dangerous to be on the bike path. And that pisses off drivers because I'm in their
Yeah.
way.
Sure.
But on the other
So,
hand, good.
so could you clarify? So I just for interest, right in front of the museum on Lamasny and Causeway, there are bike lanes that are separated, but they're separated in the center of the lane.
Yes, so that's pretty horrible too,
Okay.
because as a cyclist, you got to get to the middle and then you got to get out of the middle.
Right.
And then also further up in that area, you've got bike lanes that are next to each other going in opposite directions,
Yes.
which is
Yes.
kind of scary because a lot of cyclists don't really respect the sanctity of the direction in the lane
Hmm.
because they're not that wide, the
Yeah.
lanes themselves.
Right.
And if you're trying to pass someone, you drift into the other lane, or maybe you've got a bag on your handlebars or whatever.
Hmm.
I
Or
find them
you're one of those wider format quote unquote
exactly,
bike. Yeah.
exactly wider form. There's lots of ways that it can be scary for me there.
Got
Um,
it.
and what's even worse is there's a bike lane as you come up to the intersection, and then if you want to make a left, you have to go across the 3 lanes of traffic and then make a left from there. And all that's to some extent unsolvable. There's no perfect solution. There are less bad solutions or better solutions. There's
Yeah.
nothing that's going to get rid of the bike car conflict.
Sure.
We can try and mitigate it as best we can with slower speeds. But as we move into a more electrified bike slash electrified micro mobility world,
Hmm.
slower speeds, even for those non-car things, are
Yeah.
increasingly becoming faster. I'm the slowest thing out there that doesn't have square wheels. I'm
Right.
getting passed by people on electric skateboards. I'm getting passed by electric bikes. I'm getting passed by all these things.
Hmm.
And it's really unnerving.
Yeah, so I want to hit on this kind of conflict between um, bikes and other forms of transportations because um, when in the early 1900s when cars were kind of overtaking bikes, part of the reason they were able to do that was because bike advocates had for years and years been trying to, and somewhat successfully, getting better paved roads to make bike safer. Um, those roads obviously became car roads, but they became roads for cars even in cities like Boston and Cambridge, where really it might have been better for the infrastructure to stay bike focused. It might have been able to handle more traffic that way. I kind of wonder how you see that transition, that why everywhere, cars ended up taking over, not just in, let's say, you need a car to get from Amherst to Boston, but you don't really need one to get from Cambridge to Boston.
Right. You set me up with that question earlier, and I tried to do some minimal amount of research online. You asked me for why I thought that. I wanted to figure out what other people are. And it turns out that a couple of Google searches got me nothing. So I didn't go any deeper than that. But cars became a thing in Boston a bit after World War II,
Right.
when service members coming home, there's a lot of wealth. The factories that had been building tanks and trucks shifted back over to private vehicles.
Sure.
And folks started thinking of, well, we can go for a pleasure drive, even if it's just around Boston. And then one day the whole city got full of traffic. And that's when we started thinking, oh, we got to worry about things like parking or highways, super highways.
Right.
But in, say, the 23s to the start of the Second World War, there weren't the number of cars that we have, so there wasn't the conflict that we have. There was a
Right.
conflict.
They were just a cool thing that you could have if you had enough money.
They were a cool thing you could have if you had enough money. A fair number of people had enough money, but not a lot. They were still relatively rare. They were common enough, though, that at one point, I think it was in New York City, a car hit a horse and buggy. It was a fatal accident, and that led to the first traffic light. So that's arguably the first example of infrastructure changing in relation to the stuff that's actually using the streets. And we're kind of there again now. We have a whole new type of uses, and we need to rethink our infrastructure from a safety standpoint. But biking can be a lot of fun.
Right.
Logistically, it's very challenging once it's more than you. And if you go back to, God, probably, even like 1965 or 75, the metallurgy, the technology of building strong trailers and gearing and things like that, that wasn't there. So you
weren't doing full stamps of a bike frame.
Whatever that means, yes.
Sorry, so that you would have to make it in pieces, and so it would be much weaker, right? Today, most high-end bike frames are going to be a single stamped piece out of the factory,
or they're carbon fiber. But also what you have now. So the bikes that I was showing you earlier, the cargo bikes, those are really complicated pieces of technology, whether they're electric or not. Simply making them work is complicated. The trailer that I have a beautiful 8-foot Bikes at Work trailer. That's a complicated piece of machinery. The ability to make those things and make them commercially available at a reasonable price just didn't exist in 1925. So
how are you navigating with your bike and an 8-foot trailer through Cambridge?
Careful, but it's not wider than a normal bicycle. The trailer's 2 feet wide. So as long as I'm going straight, I am fine. And you realize that you're very much like a tractor trailer. You have to take the curves wide, and I'm going 8 or 10 or 12 miles an hour, so I'm pretty slow. The challenge we have with all sorts of transportation, it becomes dangerous when things are not dependably consistent and predictable. So as long as I am going straight at a consistent speed, I am safe. Now, other people may do something, maybe they're on their phone or something, or they turn without looking. But as long as everyone is following the rules, I'm good, even with my big trailer. The canoe, I use it on the 4th of July. And there's not a lot of traffic. But again, same thing, as long as I am going safe, even though with my canoe, I'm now 20-something feet long, as long as I'm going straight and not making turns, I'm good. Because there's always that, or almost always, enough space on the side of the cars. And if there isn't, I stop. And one thing that having a canoe behind you does, it attracts people's attention.
Yeah, fair enough.
And so if I am seen by a driver, I am much safer. Every driver that's ever hit me didn't see me. I'm like, well, how did you miss me? But there's a great video of a guy in a gorilla suit moving through a bunch of people shooting basketballs.
Uh-huh.
No one sees the gorilla. It's right there in the open. No one sees the gorilla. So it's easy to overlook even the obvious.
Sure.
And that's something a cyclist or someone, I say cyclist, but really it's anyone. But the most at danger are the cyclists or the people on the e-bikes or whatever.
Sure.
They just need to be aware that not everyone is paying attention all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so getting into that a little more, right? That, I mean, I guess what do you see as the big problem? I guess beyond just like there aren't enough lanes on the highway, right? I mean, what are like the underlying problems that face a metropolitan area like Boston working with?
Let's see what we have here. I might have more pictures. All right, so that's a good picture. This is a new office building.
Okay.
But it could be a new residential building as well.
Sure.
Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, the whole greater Boston area up until a month ago was just booming in terms of construction. We'll see what the economic slowdown does.
Sure. But at least everything that was being built will still be being built, presumably.
Well, one thing, so, who knows? There'll probably be gaps in filling up the leases and whatever. Sure. But this is an illustration of what we're building. So this is going up. This is probably like 10 stories from the bottom. Sure. The streets didn't get any wider. All right. The subway didn't get any more capacity. Nothing else got bigger except this. Right. Or the other 10,000 buildings just like that. So we're bringing in more jobs. We're bringing in more people. The Metropolitan Area Planning Council says we need something like another 35,000 housing units in the greater Boston area. And I might be understating that number in the next 10 years, if not sooner. Mm-hmm. And yet none of the supporting infrastructure is really getting bigger to handle it.
Well, how would you, right? Because the Green Line, no question. But I mean, without almost building like double-decker roads, I mean, there's no room in, say, Boston proper.
Not true. We have plenty of capacity, and that capacity is in the existing cars that are driving around with a driver and 4 empty seats.
That's interesting.
So, well, it's interesting.
No, I mean, it really interesting. So, how do you address that?
You could do it in a couple of ways, none of which anyone that I've ever talked to likes. But one of the things you could do is you could say anyone that needs a permit for a parking garage is not going to let a car into that parking garage with less than 3 people in it. So you drive in from Lexington, mm-hmm. You got to pick up 2 people somewhere on the way, or you got no place to park.
Okay.
We would force it because otherwise people will drive by themselves and they'll get stuck in traffic, and they hate being stuck in traffic, but they'd rather do that than carpool for a variety of reasons. One of which is the mathematics behind carpooling make it really tough time-wise to say it's worthwhile to pick 2 or 3 people up. So that's one thing you do. Say we're going to require 3 people in a car to enter the parking garages between these times. We could also say that as a region, we could say that on some of our main streets. Sure. We might run into commerce clause problems there. I'm not entirely certain, because as a nation, we're governed by the Constitution, and Boston can't do things to make life harder for Connecticut. That's where the commerce clause comes in. We can't ban certain types of trucks and then shift all that truck traffic into Connecticut. The thing that we could do is we've got, I don't have it handy, but I do. So you know what this is, right?
Your phone?
Yes, this is my phone. And it's also a GPS system.
Oh, sure.
And it can be used, the information on that can be used to pinpoint exactly where people are coming from and where people are going. Right. And we can design, it's called microtransit. So you got micromobility, which is me on my bicycle or scooter or something. You got mass transit, which is you coming in to work on the train. And you've got this thing in the middle called micromobility. And there's a company called Bridge that was doing it for a while. But
Okay.
it's someone with a 6 or an 8 or 10-person van that picks up a bunch of riders in 1 or 2 points and drops them off in 1 or 2 points.
Oh,
And
yeah.
maybe 10 years ago it was tough to figure that out, but now we have all that data, where people are coming from and where they're going, and we've got obsolete rules on how these delivery systems need to get permitted and how their stops need to be permitted and so forth. Technology can help us move people faster and easier if we just let it. So that part's there. And then the third thing is, we could tell these people, fine, go ahead and build your building, but you're not building any parking. Right now, we require parking. From a planning standpoint, I think we would be much better off these days to say, you can build what you want, you can't build any parking. And then people will figure out that whole carpooling, micro-mobility, micro-transit option, or even smoothing
and that
out.
would actually help with the housing problem too, right? I mean, there's all this space in buildings that currently is going to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. One of the things we have in Cambridge is you build your parking in association with a residential structure.
Sure.
You may charge $200 a month for someone to park there. Well, I would say I only use my car on weekends. Rather than paying $200 a month, I'm going to pay $25 a year, get an on-street parking sticker, and park it a quarter mile away, and then just leave it there until I need it.
Yeah.
So a lot of these parking garages in the residential buildings are largely empty.
Interesting.
So that's my big building picture. Let's see what else we have here. So this is downtown Boston,
Absolutely,
not that far from the museum. Maybe a week and a half ago, it was, I believe, a Wednesday at 2:30 or something like that.
Yeah,
it's empty. It's probably emptier today. I was out in Central Square packing food earlier this morning, and similarly, empty. So you can see that the streets don't have to be full of cars, but you also know that none of these businesses are full of customers, or offices are full of workers or whatever. And we've got this idea that the two have to be connected. You got to have the traffic to bring in the people to do whatever. And that's not entirely true. We have to have some traffic bringing the people in. But if we use the vehicles more efficiently, then we will have a much easier time to move around. And there's some really good math. Oh, wait a minute. This is a video. Check this out. I mean, you get an idea just how empty that thing is.
The cars that look like they're moving when it's a photo are actually parked. There's
they are absolutely parked. There's a couple of joggers moving there, and that's about it. And this is right on the edge of the financial district, so it is vacant. And when COVID-19, I don't know if runs its course is the right word, but when we come out of this current crisis and merge into an endemic, or maybe it's gone forever, one that doesn't know yet, I think we're still going to have difficulty getting people to think. I'm going to back this up just a little bit. So right here, not letting me go backwards. There's an MBTA bus I want to show you.
Okay.
Right? See that?
Yeah.
That's an MBTA bus. They are all running empty these days. All of them. They go by my house. I look at them. There's no one on these things. And part of it is because if you're concerned about germs, getting on a bus or a train or a subway or an airplane.
No question. I've been on a subway, I think, once since the kind of shutdown started, and it's just really uncomfortable.
It is uncomfortable, and I don't know when we're going to dig our way out of that. I don't know if we're going to dig our way out of that. So I think what we're going to see, even after businesses start back up and so forth, we're going to see a crush for people driving. So folks are going to get in earlier to get the parking spots. And then we're going to see a crush for Ubers, which right now Uber drivers are struggling to stay afloat because no one's really Ubering. and you don't want to get in a car that is perhaps driven by someone or has been ridden in by someone who is sick.
Sure.
But we're gonna solve those problems with, I think, Uber and so forth, in terms of once this is over, there's going to be some Uber related formal procedure to disinfect the car. And so someone's going to provide that as an extra service. You pay an extra $1 to get in the car that's disinfected between riders or whatever it might be. But we're also, I think, going to see a bigger push towards micromobility options that are like bicycles, in terms of maybe they have pedals, because if you have pedals, regulations apply differently, but look more like golf carts. And so I told you earlier, we've got this phone, and then you've got the motors that people are using to put car windows up and down. They've been around for a while. And you've got some really good battery work going on. So Teslas are essentially powered by a bunch of laptop batteries strung together. You've got GPS. You've got all these different things that exist and have existed in one way or another for quite a while. And really smart people are bringing them together to create new types of tools. That's the electric bike. That's the self-driving car. That's the car sharing dockless bike that you can find on your phone. All these things are now possible because smart people have taken existing technology and married it in various ways. We're going to see more really smart, capable people coming up with options that people feel more comfortable with than this bus or the subway train.
But doesn't that in itself create a new set of problems that the sort of
Of course. It does. And the challenge we have is we've got a lot of backwards thinking leaders, and even bicycle advocates are, I think, backwards thinking. They're thinking bikes. Well, there are these things called eco-totems. There's one not that far from your museum. And there's one in Kendall's, eco-totems. They count bikes as they go by.
Oh, yes. There's one, just across from the museum.
And you can go online and you can see dozens of these eco-totems around the world. And you can go back in time and you can compare the bike growth. And I've done that a couple of times. And generally, the bike growth is flat for the past 3.5 years that these things have been more or less popular. So I don't think we're going to see an explosion in bike use. I think that's kind of had. It'll go up a little bit, but especially in a place like Boston where, say, 25% of the time it's too cold, too wet, too snowy, too dark, too something for people to want to ride. And then maybe 5% of the time it's too hot for people to want to ride. Certainly in Miami, my brother lives in Miami, and it gets so hot there in the summertime. He says no one goes outside between the hours of
no
right. So the idea that somehow biking is going to solve the transportation problem. Remember earlier I talked about the bike shares being 30% unreliable, and you couldn't have a system that was 30% unreliable. You can't have a transportation system that people use only when it's not raining out. Like if you're going to build a non-car transportation system and bicyclists are going to say, we want our share of the road, it's got to get used all the time. Again, the picture I showed you of the building going up, buildings are going up, but the roads aren't going wider or higher. So we need to use the space more efficiently. People are going to figure out, and I've got other pictures that aren't on this slideshow, of small golf cart-like things, because the batteries and the motors and the metallurgy and all this stuff has gotten better and better. You're now able to put a strong but light vehicle together that will hold two people. You can pedal it reasonably fast, but it's got a battery, so it'll go 12 miles an hour without a lot of effort. And you know, if I live in North Cambridge and I want to go into Faneuil Hall, that's 6 miles, I can get there on this little thing at 12 miles an hour as fast as I can on almost anything else. I'll just take my, and again, it's now
for the T, you have to wait for a bus. So.
Don't have to wait for the T. I don't have to worry about parking. I don't get stuck in traffic. But as you said, as these things start exploding in number, you're going to create a lot of other problems because they take more space, they turn differently, they stop differently, they have different speeds. And the whole space that cyclists just sort of iconically think is theirs is actually space that anything that's not a car uses,
Right.
whether it's rollerblades or electric scooters or people in electric medical mobility devices who are also, as pedestrians, allowed on the sidewalk. All that stuff happens in that little space between your traditional car lane and the curb, or the parking, or the whatever. And the different speeds create this type of transportation turbulence that is horribly dangerous. So I have whiplash from getting hit. I stopped for a pedestrian in a crosswalk, and the guy behind me didn't stop. A 180-pound guy in a 20-pound bicycle going 12 miles an hour has a lot of energy. And my neck will probably hurt till the day I die. He was a jerk, but it wasn't really his fault in the sense that bikes don't have warning lights when you hit the brakes.
Right.
So there are all these things. Arguably, we need a new set of rules. You shouldn't stop. As a cyclist, you should stop for nothing but a stop sign or a red light, something that people behind you can see. Because the pedestrians coming out of the sidewalk are frequently not visible to the cyclists behind you because they're off to the right. And so you hit the brakes because you see this thing. The person behind you is looking forward, looking for traffic, has no idea that there's a pedestrian there. And that extra half second is just too much for people to be able to hit the brake. So we're going to need new rules. These cars, one person cars have to stop. We just have to stop that.
I was going to ask, what degree does having one person in a car, I mean, how much capacity could you gain by, because obviously 4 bikes aren't really going to function in the space that one car is functioning in, right?
That is a great point. So, you've probably seen these posters too. It shows 30 people sitting where a bus would carry 30 people, and however many cyclists, and one person in a car kind of thing. That is a misleading picture of how many people on a certain type of transportation can sit immobile on a public way.
Sure.
Once these things start moving, the people on the bus, obviously the bus just moves, but the people on bikes become this bubbly sort of cauldron of different speeds of people turning and maybe talking on their phone and maybe passing on the right, maybe passing on the left, maybe bumping into each other. It becomes incredibly, incredibly hectic. And we don't have
the new talking on your phone laws. Those don't apply to bikes.
No, they don't apply to bikes, but we do have laws that keep you from taking your hands off the handlebars. You need to have your hands on the handlebars, and bike laws are a little bit, they could be clarified.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the idea that all these bicycles are going to act predictably is just wrong. So your point of, 4 cyclists moving down the street do not occupy some block of 4 cyclists. They're constantly shifting blob of space.
So I mean, going back to that sort of, what are the big problems? I guess, kind of looking at what the future of urban mobility will look like. Are there clear solutions, or is there something that, like, even if it's sort of a wave a magic wand kind of thing, is there a solution that could move everyone who works in Boston into Boston and out of Boston each day? That, does that thing exist today?
It doesn't exist actually today, but it could. If I just waved the magic wand using the technology we have, these people all have 4 folks in the car.
Right.
No car's got 1 person in it. Inside of 128. That would be my perfect world.
Right. So I've reduced traffic now by 50%, let's say.
Yes. These people, well, maybe we still have buses, but I think it's going to be a challenge in the future to get people back on board buses. But we're going to see a lot of, in my perfect world, a lot more micro transit. So it's a 12-passenger van. It's got 1 driver. It is something that's almost concierge service in terms of the
Right.
driver doesn't know where they're going until they pick the people up, and the people don't really know where they're going until they know where they're going, but they don't know who they're getting on with. Because
Right.
our phones, you're going to say, this is where I am, this is what I want to go. And much like Uber or all these other transportation devices will shuttle your rides, it
Hmm.
will do that, but it'll just do it on a larger scale. And so,
Right.
if you got 7 people here that all say, I got to go back to Wilmington at between 5:15 and 5:30,
Right.
boom, they get dinged with a text at 4:45 that says meet right here, because maybe there's 2 other people over here. Meet
Hmm.
here at 5:15, and bus number or transit van number X is going to come pick you up. This
Right.
guy comes in, the first driver comes in, picks him up, drives up to Wilmington. Now in Wilmington, maybe there's 5 other people that get it moved around.
Right.
But one of the things we're also going to say, I think, Sebastian, is you and I were supposed to do this in person. It may wind up being
Yeah.
even better having done it distantly. I think we're going to see a push of opportunity and investment and education and so forth from the urban core, these areas.
Yeah.
We're going to see that head out, maybe not to a Wilmington, because that's close to Boston, but maybe we start seeing that happen in places like Leominster or
Okay.
Pittsfield, places that have felt the gravitational pull of the black holes of Kendall Square and the financial district in terms of drawing all that opportunity, investment, and
Yeah. Sure.
education and so forth. The idea that we can now effectively work from home, which technologically has been more or less possible, but in the
Hmm.
past 2 weeks has become a norm, may have people thinking, why am I paying tens of thousands of dollars a year to look out these 2 windows
Sure.
when I can get the same work done from Pittsfield for
Right.
a tenth the price, or
And
from my home
obviously
for free?
that's more true for some industries than other, right? If you're in product design, like it's pretty important that you be face to face with your team. But if you're an accountant, at a
Well,
firm or
we
something,
used to say
perhaps.
that of accountants, but increasingly, I think the answer is no. That's just the idea that creativity comes from being in the same office building or the same room is
Hmm.
something that people buy into. But if you had told me 20 years ago that document review would be better done by a computer than by someone with a law degree from Boston College Law School,
Hmm.
I'd have said no. But it turns out it's true. It's done quicker, it's done
Sure,
faster, it's done cheaper, and it's
but that
done more
isn't
accurately.
but that isn't a creative enterprise, right? I mean, there are certain things that you just kind of have to do physically to get. There's some value to
Well,
drawing on the
boxing,
whiteboard.
I will say, boxing. If you're going to be a professional boxer, you probably have something to hit, and that something's got to be a person. But the creativity part, we will find out. I
Yeah.
don't. I don't think so. I think we're going to get good enough at using online platforms, and 5G is going to allow us to do stuff even faster. The
Yeah,
bandwidth of
fair enough.
5G is going to widen the things that we can do, and some very smart, talented people are going to take Zoom or
Hmm.
GoToMeeting or whatever to the next level. And maybe you start having 3D holograms. That's a Star
Yeah,
Wars sort of thing, but
sure.
a lot of life was Star Wars or Star Trek or
No,
Star something or other, and now it's our day-to-day life.
yeah, sure. I mean, there was a proposal last year to put a holographic Spock statue in the common.
Yeah, that would be interesting. And we're talking about going to a digital less or whatever, non-physical currency. So,
Hmm.
blockchain is something, these things all, blockchain especially, require an immense amount of energy.
Sure.
Absolute massive amounts of energy to do the computing. So we may find that we have electric and electric production and distribution issues in terms of moving this technology around.
Sure.
But at some point, we'll figure those things out, and people, I believe, will make different decisions about whether this office is worth it. Maybe it's worth it, Sebastian, for you and me, because we're super creative together. But you and anyone else, you just as soon do it over the phone or maybe even by mail. But remember,
True enough.
1,000 years ago, you know what the leading bleeding edge technology was that gave us today's math?
1,000 years ago?
1,000 years ago. What was that new technology called?
What, the abac or printing press?
Paper.
Yeah.
Paper, not the printing press. That
No,
came
that's
500 years ago,
500.
right?
Yeah.
But paper, something that we just kind of, we wipe our noses with paper. That's what we think about paper. Um, that at one point in life was cutting edge technology, and it allowed us to go from the abacus to the Arabian Indian style math, right?
Yeah,
To go to modern calculus.
sure.
And then, of course, we haven't moved anywhere in terms of math education since then, particularly, because we
There
all
have been a few
no,
leaps.
no, there haven't. It's all done on paper, and if you're
Oh,
doing
oh,
it, if you're doing it online, you're simply you're doing the same operation that you would do on paper. You're just not writing it down. But so I think we need to remember that the world changes drastically in many ways. It's one of my favorite jokes about this is there are two ants on a redwood tree, and the redwood tree, of course, is the biggest, oldest living,
hmm
longest living thing on the world, and ants live a couple of weeks and are tiny. And the one
right.
ant says to the other ant, "Is this thing alive?" referring to the redwood tree. And the second ant says, "No, I've been here all my life and it's never moved."
Yeah,
So the point is we look at what we see and we think, well, this has been the way it is forever and it's going to just stay that way. It's not.
yeah.
And I think we'll find that in spades in the next 6 months between the financial bump, crash,
hmm
whatever one wants to call it, and the accelerant of COVID-19 on distance learning and remote working and things like that. We're going to
Sure.
rethink what it means to come back into contact with each other and the costs that we want to incur, whether it's $10,000 for these office windows, or whether it's maybe getting contaminated by riding on this bus, or whether it's maybe getting hit by a car as you ride your unicycle to work. We're going to decide whether all of that's worth it. And what we're already seeing in a lot of office buildings, you think, well, I want to come in, I want to have 25 places to go to lunch. You know
Yeah.
what people do? They go online and they order food frequently from places that aren't even restaurants.
hmm
They exist only to serve catered meals at lunch.
Right.
And after 3 o'clock, they close up and they go away.
Yep.
And people come down to the lounge area of their office building and they grab, someone will get their pizza, someone else get their Thai food, and they all sit in a group and they have a great lunch in the common area.
Yeah.
So even going out to lunch and having all those opportunities starts to become something that you can get elsewhere, to include anywhere. I could do
Yeah.
it at home. I could eat a different type of meal every day and never leave my bedroom. It'd get boring in terms of
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah, sure.
but as our computing power gets faster and so forth, and we become better at navigating the internet for this stuff, we're going to see people just thinking, yeah, I do drone games online. Or
Mm,
even
yeah.
football teams are using robots. So they use to cut down on concussions. They'll
hmm
have robots running defensive plays and whatnot. So the mix of artificial intelligence and new urban mobility and the fear of COVID-19, and then you kick in people's angst over school systems and so forth. The city of the future is going to look very different than it's
Sure.
looked in the past, but the city of the future that figures out mobility the best and gets that friction out of day-to-day life, whether it's because our trains run better or we've figured out how to move scooters around or
Yeah.
whatever it might be, that city is going to have a massive, massive head start over anyone else in managing the future.
Okay. So I think I'm just gonna ask you one last question then, and it's kind of the other side of that, right? So I obviously am interviewing you from from the perspective of anyway, the West End Museum, and the West End saw a full teardown that um, in theory was meant to build up a new space that would have these efficiencies. It certainly hasn't lived up to that, right? I mean, it has as much traffic, and blah 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 as anywhere else. But when we're looking to accommodate this kind of future of urban movement, of urban life, how do we ensure that we don't see something like the West End project again? How do we make sure that we're keeping in mind, the people who live there now, that we aren't just displacing tens of thousands of people because, well, there really should be another lane to this road?
You do that through giving people property rights. If you don't own where you live, you're going to find that someone else has a better and higher use for it. Of
Well,
course, even if you do own where you live, the government can come in by eminent domain and say, you know what? We need this thing for a factory. We need this thing for a new sports stadium or for parking for the
well, I
sports
mean, that's
stadium.
exactly what happened in the
It
West
is.
End, right?
It is what happened. And the way that stops is people elect officials who don't want to do that, who
Right.
say no, realizing that the world is not a museum. So the world is not a time capsule. And if you go through the North End, it's super charming. I love the North End. As a matter of fact, any historic city is really much more pleasant than the newer cities that spring up around them. And one can see that in the World War II damaged cities of Europe,
Sure.
the charming older places and the post World War II places. But one has to be careful that when we look at older stock, we realize that that stock needs to be maintained, that that stock sometimes needs to be upgraded. So very difficult, for example, if you have some sort of mobility challenge to get in
Sure.
and out of some of these buildings. So we want to approach our older, denser buildings and areas as a place where, or as a resource
Sure.
that allows people to live in dense neighborhoods.
Hmm.
At the same time, we want to try and help the modern amenities of elevators come in and make those places so that the West End was, people called those places tenements.
Sure. But
And
they
it
were
was,
actually mansions that had been refurbished.
yes, but at the time they were tenements, and
Yes.
same with other places in New York City and so forth. Um, Over time, people who didn't live there anymore, or maybe never did live there,
Hmm.
only saw this sort of crowded thing where they couldn't imagine living. So we'll do
Right.
everyone a favor and get rid of it. And the reality is, these places are neighborhoods, and sometimes time passes them by. And I think we want to make sure that as we develop the cities of the future, we see these neighborhoods for what they are. They're not
Right.
time capsules, but an
Kind of
upgrade doesn't mean
lift
you
them up
flatten them.
instead of tearing them down.
Yes, and you don't flatten them and say, "Good, we made the place better." You
Yeah.
look at them and say, "Okay, now what rules do we need to change?" Arguably, a place like the West End, if you had gotten rid of cars completely,
Sure.
you could have solved a lot of what people perceive to be problems in terms of crowding by providing more public space. But when
Well,
this,
yeah, I was going to say, in the original plans for the West End, like Charles River Park and stuff, they were supposed to receive these huge expansions, and they didn't end up receiving. There's supposed to be all this green space between all of the towers, and that green space ended up being much, much less than originally planned because they ended up incorporating these large highways and things into the plan.
and is anyone surprised by that? That is typical with these projects. They are sold with the sweetener of, well, we'll give you all this green space, or we'll give you a pedestrian bridge over the Charles River in terms of, mitigating for the big dig and so forth.
Yeah, sure.
The big dig gets built. The cars
Hmm.
are going underneath the city. That bridge is still not there.
Yeah.
So mitigating sweeteners frequently don't happen, and often, even when they happen, don't happen the way they were promised to get the
Right.
main project through. So my comment for the future of a West End type place is be super cynical of all the promises and make them super enforceable, either through some sort of specific bond issue, something that can't go away. Maybe you put
Sure.
funds in some sort of account that can only be accessed for a particular use. Because if you're depending on the leftovers from the big dig to get the pedestrian bridge, and the Rose Greenway is beautiful as it is, that too was a long struggle even after the big dig was finished.
Sure. Sure. Okay, well, Craig, I don't know, is before I wrap up, is there anything that like I should have asked you that I didn't, or that you think we should have covered?
So one of the things that's just popping into my mind now
Sure.
is we talked a little bit, we talked in terms of West End and people with physical challenges and limitations in terms of mobility.
Sure.
The idea that biking or micromobility is going to fit everyone's needs just isn't there. And I think there's an ableism that comes with being a mobility or micromobility, and especially a bike advocate,
Hmm.
that we all need to be careful of, because a lot of people are scared to bike, maybe don't have the balance issues that a scooter would allow. Perhaps they've got 3 kids and an older parent that they've got to move around. So
Sure.
there are a lot of reasons why people use cars that have nothing to do with being selfish or hating the world or anything like that. And I think it's important to have these transportation discussions, understanding that. So
Yeah, sure.
people often say, Craig, oh, you're so good. You bike everywhere. So good for the environment. Yeah, the place I like biking the most is France. I love flying to France and biking there. And, once you get there, sure, it's a relatively benign experience, but flying
Yeah.
over the Atlantic Ocean is not. So I think
Hmm.
we need always to remember that simply because we bike or scoot or whatever doesn't mean that we're saving the planet. And we've
Yeah.
conflated that discussion, I think, in a very bad way over time.
Hmm. All right. Well, thanks so much for chatting with me today with the museum. I'd like to take a moment just to both thank you for coming, thank people for watching when they watch, and to all the volunteers that are making this video possible behind the scenes. I'd also like to encourage people to support businesses in the West End and Cambridge, especially small businesses that are struggling right now with the pandemic, so that they can return soon better than ever. And of course, I'll ask you to consider donating to the museum or joining our mailing list using description or using links that will be in the description for this video. You can also visit us on Twitter at West End Museum, and Instagram at the West End Museum, or on Facebook. And Craig, I don't know if you have somewhere you'd like people to reach you.
Sure, you can reach me via my website at Craig at urbancorestrategies.com,
Great.
Craig Kelley1 at Twitter, and I have Facebook somewhere, but I couldn't tell you what it is.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and I hope you'll be
Thanks a
able
lot,
to visit the
Sebastian. I hope to
museum
see you in
soon.
real life and the museum soon. I haven't yet made it to the bike exhibit. It
Yeah,
can't go
well,
without my seeing it.
no, we'll have to get you in. All
Sounds
right.
good. Thanks a
Talk to
lot.
you later.
Bye
Bye.
bye.